Hi, I'm Mandy. I'm one of the co-owners and workers at Pilsen Community Books, and I am so excited to welcome Chris Stedman and Kristen Arnett here tonight to celebrate Chris's brand new book, IRL, out last week from Broadleaf. Um, and there's just a few notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce Chris and Kristen, and then Chris will read a bit from his book, which I'm so excited. And then Chris and Kristen will be in conversation. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A. So if you have any questions at all during the event, you can just drop them in the chat, and I'll keep a lookout for them and read them out at the appropriate time. And this would not be a bookstore event if I did not mention that you can buy Chris's book on our website, www.pilsencommunitybooks.com. And we also have a very beautiful stack of them on our front table, and they just look so great. I encourage you to pick one up. This spot gloss here, Chris, is really nice. They did such a great job on the cover. So without further ado, I will introduce tonight's guest. Chris Stedman is a Minneapolis-based writer, speaker, teacher, and community organizer. He is the author of IRL, Finding Realness, Meaning, and Belonging in Our Digital Lives, why we're here tonight, and Faithiest. Chris has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and PBS, and has written for publications including The Guardian, The Atlantic, BuzzFeed, Pitchfork, Vice, The Rumpus, LA Review of Books, Catapult, and Washington Post. Previously the founding director of Yale Humanist Community and a fellow at Yale University, Chris also served as humanist chaplain at Harvard University. He currently teaches in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Augsburg University and serves as the network of ELCA colleges and universities 2020 to 2021 visiting lecturer. And Kristen Arnett is a New York Times bestselling author of the debut novel Mostly Dead Things, which sells so well at the store, Kristen, we love it. Which was listed as one of the New York Times top books of 2019 and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in Fiction. She is a queer fiction and essay writer, and she was awarded the 9th Letters Literary Award in Fiction, and is a columnist for Literary Hub. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, North American Review, The Normal School, Gulf Coast, Tri-Quarterly, Guernica, BuzzFeed, Electric Lit, McSweeney's, PBS NewsHour, Bennington Review, Guardian, Salon, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. And her story collection, Felt in the Jaw, which is also amazing, was published by Split Lip Press and was awarded the 2017 Coyle Book Award. She was a Spring 2020 Shearing Fellow at Black Mountain Institute, and her next 2 books will be published by Riverhead. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much to everyone at Pilsen Community Books for hosting this event tonight. I am so excited about doing this event, specifically with this bookstore. And thank you, Kristen, for being here. We'll have plenty of time to chat. So I'm going to start with a very short excerpt from the beginning of the book, that's literally the first pages of the book. So let's start right there. So this is from chapter 1, which is called Amateurs. What does it mean to be real? Realness has always been a slippery concept, one so big and complicated it's dealt with as a central problem in religious traditions like Buddhism and Christian Science. But it feels especially loaded these days in our ever more digital lives, when the platforms that we increasingly use to connect, express ourselves, and find information are so often cast as fake. The already inherently difficult question of realness, how can I know who I really am, feels almost unanswerable now. Given the impossible immensity of the question, there are many places I could begin. I start with a drag show. It was amateur night at a gay bar when performers just dipping their toes into the drag waters get their start. I was newly single and begrudgingly following friends' advice to put myself back out there. Like many of the queens on stage that night, I felt very much like a novice. A woefully out-of-practice flirt I mostly kept to myself. Whenever I glanced up from my phone, I focused almost entirely on the gritty, glittering performers. New to the stage and not yet sure what the crowd would reward and what it would reject, many of these amateur queens were boldly, unapologetically messy. Others were more like me, broadcasting the same tentativeness as my furtive glances away from the glow of my phone screen. unable to hide the nervousness behind their masks of generously applied makeup. Tip for the uninitiated: the makeup on your face needs to match your neck. From cocksure to crushingly insecure, the queens were all over the map. But there was a magic in the messiness of amateur night, its combination of audacity and naked vulnerability that overtook me. Maybe it's how chaotic my own life felt at that moment. My boyfriend of nearly 5 years had just moved out of the apartment we shared. I was navigating thorny challenges at work, and everything around me seemed uncertain. Whatever the reason, something about the atmosphere of the show clicked. It felt more real than many of the more practiced drag performances I had attended. I could see the queens taking risks, experimenting. I could see their nerves, their excitement, and their courage. It was clear that in both their confidence and their hesitance, they were thinking less about what might earn them a paycheck and more about what they wanted to say. None of them exhibited the perfection that was exhausting me in my social media feeds. The digital boasts and brags, the job announcements, engagement photo shoots, new houses, vacations, that made me feel worse about my own life, one that seemed determined not to go according to plan. Instead, they embodied the growing part of me that felt like maybe it was time to tear up the playbook, all the rules about what I should and shouldn't do, what I should and shouldn't value, what made my life matter, what made it real, and try something new. In drag, the concept of realness doesn't necessarily mean what you might think. For many drag artists, realness isn't about trying to pass, to blend in with the crowd without notice, but rather about standing out and apart. By disrupting and shining a light on our assumptions, drag realness can expose that what is most real is in the in-between, in the blurring itself, in tearing up the playbook of gender. The realness of drag is that it heightens, dramatizes, and deviates in order to reveal. It holds up a mirror to us, showing us the gender baggage we inherit and inviting us to discard our conventions. This is what the digital pieces of our lives can do too. If we look at them honestly, they can be a mirror that reveals what we're attached to, what scripts we follow, and what these things say about how we understand ourselves. Our digital drag shows us what our culture considers perfection, perfect beauty, perfect relationships, perfect lives, and then asks if we want to discard these things too. It is a laboratory, a space where we can experiment, a space to try things that might not work, things we're not good at yet, and see what we learn from them. Perhaps the most famous quote about drag is RuPaul's, "You're born naked and the rest is drag." We are born a blank slate and then spend our lives layering ourselves with costumes, masks, outfits. We all eventually face a choice: live by the scripts we've inherited or forge our own way. At its best, drag shows us the flimsiness of those scripts and how much our sense of self is shaped by the world around us. Only when we see that influence for what it is, as with drag's hyper-realness, its exaggeration, its camp and humor, can we try another way. The internet shows us the flimsiness of our scripts too, not regarding gender specifically, though sometimes, but rather in terms of what we think makes us real, what makes us human. The catfishes, people who assume an online identity different from who they are offline. The filters, software that alters the shades or colors of a photo to enhance it, or increasingly goes much further in enabling people to dramatically manipulate their physical appearance. The deep fakes, videos created using artificial intelligence that look deceptively real. The curated digital selves we create. All these things fundamentally uproot what we have thought constitutes realness and show us how incomplete that understanding was. This uprooting presents us with an opportunity to imagine another way forward. If we let it, the internet can reveal us to ourselves, all the posing and hiding we do, and give us a chance to ask ourselves who we really are, how we see ourselves, and how much of that is shaped by the scripts we've internalized. As a result, we have a chance to write some new code. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, writes Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki, but in the experts, there are few. To be human is to forever be a beginner, tripping around in the dark, trying to understand who we are and what animates our lives. It is only in recognizing that we don't have the answers that we can begin to ask ourselves the questions that matter. We're all building ourselves online and off, but when it comes to the digital realm, none of us really know how we're coming off, how we appear. It's like we think we're ready for the headliner slot when, in actuality, we're performers on amateur night, trying things out, making fools of ourselves, exposing our humanity in the process. Which is exactly why the internet may be the best venue we've ever had for exploring questions of realness. In our messy attempts to stage a show, social media gives us a chance to see that when it comes to being human, we are all amateurs. Thank you very much. Thanks.
That was terrific.
Thanks.
Yeah. First of all, I love the opening to this book. So hearing you read from that particular portion, opening up like our conversation to talk about the book that you've had come out is like really meaningful to me. And also it's like, I think it's very fascinating to think about the idea of like a real conversation in terms of like, you know, when we're doing like book tours and different things like that and putting events together and like in reality, I'm going to try and be like very charming, but I also have like a Word document open in front of me and have like a lot of anxiety about making sure that I ask you all the questions that I want to ask you. So it's, thank you for letting me talk with you, for asking me to be part of this with you. Cause I do have a giant Word document in front of me with lots of questions.
Well, thank you for being a part of this with me, and thank you for having enough to say that can fill a Word document. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
It's like one of those things. So, I mean, I'm a little like right off the bat, I think it's always good to start with like, because I'm a writer too, and I think as writers we're like very interested in process and like origin stories of like how books begin. So I think like a natural place to start is to ask, you know, like what prompted the writing of this book for you and like the origin story of it. And like what the process of writing it was like for you. I think that's always like, and I will add like a little further question onto it, because this is a thing I like, is like when you were writing it, did you see the book as a specific kind of shape in your head?
Yeah, so
all of those questions at once at you.
Okay, I'll see if I can, and please feel free to direct me back on course if I get astray here. But yeah, I mean, I really like that question because this is going to sound really dramatic, but also I'm gay, so you know, it's part of the course. But there was definitely a period where I thought I might not. So I published my first book 8 years ago, almost exactly 8 years ago, and there were definitely points where I thought I might not do that again, for many reasons. But a big part of it, honestly, was that I kept talking to people who were like, "So when's the next book coming?" And I just felt like I don't really have anything to say right now. I mean, I had, things I was interested in, but maybe it's the contrarian in me, but I was like, I don't want to write a book just to write a book. Like, and really, honestly, yeah. I can't. Like, it takes so much work for me to like get words out and then shape them into a book that I just like, it has to be something that I can't stop thinking about if it's going to turn into a book. And so the sort of earliest nascent part of this book really kind of began to emerge in 2016, this year, when I was going through, I mean, what a cliche, right? I was going through like huge change in my life. My relationship ended really unexpectedly. My job ended really unexpectedly. I moved back to my home state. And so I was just going through all this change, and I found myself wanting to write again. And almost everything I wrote in 2016, like, is long gone, hopefully buried. That was just like emotional purging for me, not at all. And really, like, the reason I write is, to figure out what I think about things. It's very much, I'm a writer who works my way through and toward ideas. And so a lot of that figuring out is just for me, and that stuff I just keep for myself. If I'm going to publish writing, it's with the hope that it's actually like a useful tool for others who are trying to think their way through ideas too. And I started to realize that this was what I was working on, was becoming that. As the more I worked on it, I have to say my agent, Eric Hain, was this, like, just the book wouldn't exist without him. I mean, I was trying initially because the only way I knew how to write a book was how I wrote my first one. And so I was trying initially to kind of shape this book into a shape like my first one, which was a kind of chronological memoir, that sort of was structured, from point A, beginning of my life, to point B, my life now. And he helped me see that what I was actually writing around was these different images. So one chapter I use cartography as this image, as a way of trying to make sense of our digital lives. Another I use tattoos, another I use games. And I was trying to sort of make those things fit into this chronological narrative, and it just wasn't working. Yeah. And he really gave me permission to, like, totally tear everything up and restructure it. So the shape that I had in my head at the beginning was very different from what it became. And in terms of process, I mean, I am pretty obsessive. I mean, I do, like, literally have OCD, but so I put it through, so when I wrote way more, because again, I'm sort of I'm trying to figure out what I think about things as I write. So I wrote way more than I actually needed, and that it was actually anyone would ever want to read. And so I put it through my own sort of round of edits first. Then my wonderful agent, who just goes above and beyond in so many ways, did a round of edits. And then I had this incredible group of readers across disciplines, like a sociologist, a creative writing professor, a journalist, a community organizer. I tried to sort of pull in people who could bring different vantage points. And they all read the book and gave feedback on that. And so I did all of that before I even brought it to my editor at the publisher. And then we did edits together. And so, I mean, this is a very, this was a long, long process, but also it was a very different kind of project for me in all kinds of ways. Like, there's a lot of reporting in the book. There's a lot of interviews. There are experiences that I specifically sought out for the book versus sort of reflecting on events that had just happened in my life. And so I just really wanted to take my time with it. And, again, I think the book, when I write, I try to follow my curiosity wherever it's sort of taking me. And the book became something very different than what I was initially envisioning. But that for me was like the fun of it. Actually, I think a difference for me between the first book and this book is that when I finished my first book, which was, a lot of personal excavating, not that this book also wasn't, it definitely was, but I think I was just so exhausted by that I couldn't really imagine doing it again. Whereas this book was also exhausting, but it was also really energizing. And so I feel actually like it's just come out, but I'm already working on a new project, and I feel energized and excited, which definitely feels a little different.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I mean, I think I feel quite often the same way, is the idea of like writing that's energizing, or writing I think that's like doing work, is writing in which I'm like asking a question and finding more questions, which I think is like really helpful. So I don't know, that's like so lovely to hear. I always like to hear about, like, because it's like you talking about like the book also is like a book being like in conversation. I love the idea of like a book being in conversation with people. A question I'm going to ask you next, because I was fascinated with this, is because I'm a little older than you, but I was like really thinking a lot about like first experiences online and like what those looked like for myself also as a queer person. Like my first experiences online were like with the AOL CDs. In my parents' house on like our one shitty computer that was like in my brother's room. And I would log on to AOL, but it took so long for AOL to log on that I would click to log on, and then go in the kitchen and put in the oven a Stouffer's French bread pizza, which took about 17 minutes to cook. And by the time the Stouffer's French bread pizza was done, I was in AOL, it felt like. Or like the amount of time it would take like a fucking web page to download. And then like, what was I even looking at? Like a MIDI file of like, I don't know, somebody's like thing about Hanson, the band. But, so I wanted to ask you, and another thing too, yeah, it was like, for me, it was like, I was in a lot of like AOL chat rooms because I was, at the time I didn't consider it to be this, but very much like exploring like the fact that I was queer. And so like going into chat rooms, like, you know, like women looking for women, which is, you know, most likely I was not talking to other women, but it was like, what were like your like formative, like online experiences? If you could just like relate those. Cause I think that's like, it says so much about us as people, is how like we become like individuals, like through like encountering the internet and all its many facets and tortures.
Yeah, well, because right, exactly as you say, we've all kind of encountered different internets. Like I talked to people much younger than me when I was working on the book. I talked to people older than me, and depending on when you sort of came of age, your experience of the internet was very different. And for me, it was like biking to the library where there was this, there were maybe, I think it was like 6 computers total, and you had to put your name on the clipboard, and then when you would get like a 20-minute allotment. And I remember just like crouching over the computer so no one could see what I was doing. And like, I write about this in IRL specifically, like typing the word gay into the internet and just like seeing what popped up. And of course it was like, the safe search filter was on. And so
Right.
I was just, seeing some of the most family friendly types of things. But for me, it was revolutionary seeing that at that point in my life, because there was no one around me who I knew who was LGBT. And so, and I think the only like representation that I saw on television was, I think Will and Grace was on eventually, but again, their lives felt so different from mine. Like, I was growing up in Minnesota, and my life looked very different.
Mhm.
And then, I really, I felt like very disconnected, right? But the internet was the place where I could kind of first start dipping my toe into the waters a little bit. And so, yeah, the first people I ever came out to online were digital strangers. There was a safety in that, right? Because if it didn't go well, I could just close out of the
Yeah.
window.
Yeah.
But it became a way of kind of trying this act so that then I could eventually kind of, build up enough practice and bring it into other parts of my life, and come out in other spaces. And so, yeah, I think like one thing I kind of realized actually only recently is that so many of the stories in this book, like the people, because I tell a lot of other people's stories too, and so many of them are queer. And part of that is just because like I don't know a ton of straight people, but also I do think that there is something very, I do think that the queer perspective when it comes to this question of like, okay, so, suddenly for so many of us, the internet is less this kind of intentional act that we sort of space we step into and step out of that takes us 17 minutes to step into for some of us, and is now kind of integrated into all aspects of our lives. It's, less this sort of particular space and more like something that we're doing all the time. And so more and more of how we build ourselves, how we share ourselves is happening online. And this book tries to ask questions about how that is how that's influencing the way that we understand what it means to be a person. And I do think that queer people have a particularly valuable perspective to offer that conversation, because we are people who, for many of us anyway, have, spent a lot of time thinking about who we are and how we understand ourselves. I talk at different points in the book about how, I think one reason a lot of queer people are drawn to the internet is for the sort of obvious reasons like safety and access. But also, for many of us, we grew up sort of learning that you move through the world kind of constantly assessing what to share, what not to share, how people are going to respond to the different pieces of you that you share. And that, I think, is an experience we all have online. We're all kind of constantly trying to decide what's safe to share, what's not. And so I think this particular conversation, the queer perspective, is having it sort of near the center of the conversation makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I completely agree. It is this like very fascinating thing where it's like thinking about queerness and the idea of like kind of building yourself, or like this kind of like, I don't know. It's sometimes like, I know this is like, I can only speak from personal perspective, where as we all can, right? Where it's like, so often it's like a discovery of the self, but so much later in life. So it's like almost this kind of very strange delayed adolescence that kind of sits inside of it too. Cause it's like, like how puberty functions, or how like these kind of like coming of age things happen, like when you're a teenager, like when you like are specifically trying to code them inside of like spaces where it feels like safe or like okay or allowable, then like, but online feels like a space, or at least it did to me at the time. I know when I was first using the internet, it felt like that idea you were talking about, like the anonymity aspect of it, where it's like, if this isn't going well, I can click the X and it's gone, right? Like I don't have to do anything with it anymore. So I wanted to ask you too, because I feel like we all have these preferences if we're extremely online, as you and I both are, online with a capital O. Like what your favorite like platform is, because I think we all have like a favorite platform. But then also following a follow-up question to that is, have your like online habits changed? Like not even like pre-book, post-book, but also just like pandemic wise, and like where we are in terms of like quarantining, and like what did your like online look like before and the after? And also, yes, what is your favorite platform? Because I love that.
Well, so my favorite platform's Twitter. I mean, it's I think I was saying this the other day to someone, but it truly is the best and the worst of humanity. But I mean, in that way, like I think that's why I love it, right? Because you get to see everyone just like constantly figuring themselves out in real time, and like I don't know, that's the stuff that interests me. Like I do feel like because it's this space that almost like encourages impulsivity, like just put out your thought without thinking about it. Like I do think that gets us into trouble, and that certainly like causes harm. But I also do think like at least for me, Twitter has helped me in all kinds of ways, like forge very meaningful connections. Some of my closest friendships have been made through that website, but also like even just as a writer and as someone trying to sort of sift through different ideas, like I've found Twitter to be really valuable. So I feel like even though Twitter seems determined to like make the experience worse all the time, I just can't. I can't walk away from it. And in terms of the habits thing, I mean, I definitely feel like it would be wonderful if I could say like, well, I went through this 4-year exploration of what it means to be human online and came out on the other side like with 10 great tips for how to feel more real online. But that unfortunately, like the way that I am online really hasn't. I think like I learned things for sure, but like learning and applying are very different. And for me, like I'm great at learning things. I'm not always great at applying them. In some ways, like I think I write books in order to like I know that I write about like what is most sort of I write in the direction of whatever the like points of tension in my own life are, and part of that is to like figure out what I think about them, but also part of it I think is like a kind of accountability thing, like, oh, if I just like publicly say these are things I think, then maybe like people will be like, well, why aren't you living them? So
accountability.
Yeah. But I will say, definitely, like, one thing that I learned was last year I took a 3-month social media break to kind of focus on finishing the book, because I am not great with walking away from social media, and I'm very easily sort of pulled into it. And at first that was like horrible. I went through like actual withdrawal. All my friends pointed out that I was texting them in like meme format. Like I was definitely feeling it. But then it was like amazing. Then I found that I had all this extra space and time, and my ability to focus on things for longer stretches was like significantly better. And so I think I had this moment where I was like, maybe I'm done. Like maybe the end of this book is like, I'm logging off. But it occurred to me that it's like going on a meditation retreat or whatever. Like I don't like meditation retreats, but for those who do, it's like, you're at peace, you're feeling much more in touch with yourself. But part of why that is because you're like disengaged from the world, right? You're not confronted with other people's realities, with the struggles and trials of life. And so it's easy to feel more at ease and at peace. And I think when people say like just log off, as this kind of suggestion for the anxiety that so many of us feel online, what they're really saying is like just disengage from the world, which I think is valuable. And that's where I say, I think if one thing has shifted, at the end of the book, I talk about the need for what I call very cornily a velveteen habit. Because my favorite story as a kid was the Velveteen Rabbit. And I sort of use it as this touch point in the book, because the rabbit in that story wants to understand what it means to be real. And what happens with the way that the rabbit becomes real is that it experiences love and connection with the boy who owns the toy rabbit. But then the boy gets really sick and has to get rid of all of his possessions. And so the rabbit is discarded to be incinerated. And so it's not just in connection that the rabbit becomes real, it's also in experiencing loss and disconnection. And I say that, in an age where logging on is sort of less this intentional act that we step in and step out of, and more a sort of part of how we understand what it means to be human, we have to be intentional about stepping away, because it's not just in connection that we come to better understand who we are. It's also in moments where you are alone, where in boredom, in loneliness, the kinds of uncertainties and questions that we all need to face within ourselves can arise. And so for me, that is, I think, one thing that has changed the way I experience the internet, not in saying I need to just log off for the sake of disengaging, but logging off and stepping back so that I can get the perspective I need in order to re-enter the world.
Wow. Yes. I mean, I love that. Because I think it is like taking in like the kind of myriad. There's this idea of like, because it's, I mean, as corny as it sounds also, it's like there's no like, well, if you don't like it, just disengage. It's like if you're in the middle of something that's like, like really traumatic, or there's things going on, there's not really an option to be like, well, I'm powering down out of this right now. I mean, you can go to bed, I guess, but like, can you? There's like a portion of the book too, like towards the end also, where you like, because I love that you talked about Twitter, or this idea of like, you use like the terminology that you like have like in course, it's like uncertain tweeters, which I really like a lot. Or it's this idea of like not the like optimistic look of something, or not the pessimistic look of something, but kind of this like in between, where it's like I'm willing to follow the rabbit hole to see like, the yes or no, or the whatever it is, even if it's going to engage me in something that's deeply uncomfortable, or something that like goes against what I'm thinking. And I want to know if you would like talk more about that, like kind of unpack.
Sure. I'm glad you like that, because yeah, I mean, it's also corny. I like corny things. It's fine. But so yeah, when we look at like the cultural criticism or commentary on the internet, we see these sort of broad camps, right? The utopians who say the internet's making us more human, more connected, more efficient, all these sort of good things, or the sort of doomsday folks who say it's making us more isolated, more narcissistic, more lonely, more separated, more polarized. And all of those things are real. Like, there are, I think, a lot of positives about the internet. There are a lot of negatives about the internet. I think many of us, at least who are online, are sort of well aware at this point of what those things are. And there's a kind of third category, which is the folks who say that they want to sort of, that the internet's not going to go away, and we just kind of have to figure out how to use it well. And I think I started the book in a more pessimistic sort of mindset about it. I moved more toward the middle of saying, like, okay, let's just figure out like how to make this work. But I propose this fourth category, the uncertain tweeters, which is people who say, like, yes, we're gonna try and make this work, make the best of it, but also who sort of go a step further and say, actually, the kind of newness of the internet is an asset in terms of our search for a better understanding of what it means to be human. Because sort of how I open the book, I talk about amateur night, and how when you try something you're not good at yet, you get a chance to figure out things about yourself. This was something I learned when my mom made me go out for a sport in high school, which was, if my mom's watching, I love you very, very, very much. But what I would jokingly say is was kind of homophobic of you. No, I was like so opposed to the idea. I felt like, because up until then, I really stuck to the things that I was good at, geography, writing, like all very sort of bookish things, the things that came easily to me, that earned me praise, etc. Whereas my siblings were very athletic, so it made perfect sense for them to play a sport. Right. And so I thought I was being very clever. I went out for cross country because I was a horrible runner, and especially bad distance runner. So I thought, okay, I'm going to pick something I'm so bad at that there's no way I'll make the team. But what I didn't realize is everyone makes the team in cross country. So, but I ended up when I started the season, I was the worst, literally just like last place. And by the end of the season, I got the most improved award, in part because I was so bad when I started. But and then I got most improved the next year too. And not only did I learn, actually, like, I really like running, and it's something I still do to this day, but I also came to recognize that you learn specific things about yourself when you sort of try something that you're actually not good at, that you can't learn otherwise. And I think that the internet is so new, and it sort of snuck up on us. It became a part of our lives, such a big part of our lives so quickly, that we didn't really realize that we were taking things that have historically happened in sort of other kinds of spaces, things that are essential to the kind of human experience, like finding community and connection, coming to a better understanding of who we are and how to express and share that with others, that we were moving that stuff into digital space. But I feel like actually the kind of uncertainties that arise online of like, what does this mean? What did it mean that someone liked that tweet? What did it mean that no one liked that tweet? I think that those actually give us a chance to kind of look back at ourselves and the norms and conventions that, as in drag, that drag sort of exposes about gender. Mm-hmm. Gives us a chance to kind of stumble our way through these questions and look at them in a new way. So I actually think, I talk about this idea of negative capability. The poet John Keats talked about a great thinker is someone who can follow questions even when they sort of don't lead to a clear answer, who can sit in uncertainty. And I think that, if we want to become great thinkers, not in the sense of like, socially influential thinkers, but people who can think well about our own lives and our own sense of who we are, I think we need to be willing to follow that into, a lack of resolution, to uncertainty. And I think the internet gives us so many opportunities to do that.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. Oh, thank you for this conversation, just because, first of all, it's making me think about a lot of things, which is always horrible.
I know.
You have so many just little gem spots in here. Like my book that you sent me is just tagged out with Post-it notes of things that I'm gonna do something hopefully not horrible to you right now, but I'm like, read you your own, like an excerpt from your own book. Just
That
because,
is horrible,
like,
but I'll.
I was really fascinated by this like part where you're talking about like the idea of like language, like simplification of language. And you have like a section in here by this book, this here. Mandy's right; it's beautifully embossed in the center. But
I have to say, Broadleaf really like. I do think that this is such a beautiful book. They did such a great job.
no, it's beautiful. But yeah, there's this like specific part. It's like midway through the book where you have this like excerpt from like Nick White's Sweet and Low. I love Nick White. He's such a fucking fantastic writer. But like when I think about our social media bios, I'm reminded of Nick White's Sweet and Low. Summing up a person's life is a tough business. He writes of a woman trying to think of how to describe her late husband. You're bound up by simple nouns and verbs. He was a doctor, she says, a father, an amateur golfer. She pauses to think. He recycled. This is frequently how we describe ourselves online. Writer, activist, Beyonce fan. First of all, yes, I love all of that shit. But there's this like idea too where it's like I just also read like Matilda Bernstein's Sycamore's like The Freezer Door, and it's talking about like how so much there's like boundaries of language. Like language is like the great communicator, and that's how we get ideas and different things across. But also it's like there's such strict parameters that like enclose us inside of language. And when we're thinking about like accessing the internet and like in terms of like if we're thinking about Twitter, right? Like the character limitations, the idea of like trying to get like very broad, expansive ideas across in terms of these very limited like threads of things and like also interacting with others. Like, do you feel like there's like boundaries on language in terms of like communication? Like when you think about the internet, because like for me, I'm like constantly at a crossroads, like kind of trying to decipher like, you know, is this like something that's like helping me communicate with others, or is it like a hindrance because it's like, you know, like a stop block in terms of communication?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I definitely don't mind you reading out of the book, actually, because I feel like anytime I've ever had someone read my own book to me, I'm like, oh, okay, like actually that's kind of good. That's okay, you know. And you know, I mean, I think part of why I write is because the way that my mind works is like such a mess, that you know, I write to try and like organize what I'm thinking, and so when I'm speaking, sometimes I can lose track of where I'm going. So feel free to read any more if you'd like. But I do think like, and also any opportunity to shout out Nick White, who's amazing. But yeah, I mean, I think like, so one of the chapters of IRL, I use the maps as this kind of image, right? And part of that was just like, honestly, it started almost kind of selfishly. It was like, I love maps. I'm seeing a connection here. I just want to like dig into maps and see what I come across. And so, you know, I went to the map library here at the University of Minnesota and spent tons of time in this map library, and interviewed the head of the map library and the director of the Mapping Prejudice Project, which maps racial covenants that were put in deeds of houses here in Minnesota, dictating that Black people couldn't live in them, and that were still on the books for many years after they were made illegal. And, you know, when I started working on that chapter, I, you know, was sort of thinking of maps as this way of understanding the kind of like, you know, curatorial work that we all do when presenting a public self. And that's like not something that's new to the internet, right? You know, I think in IRL, I draw the parallel to like the family Christmas letter that doesn't mention dad's DUI, you know, like that's not new. But I was, you know, wanting to sort of look at maps as a way of understanding how, you know, cartographers look at this complex three-dimensional terrain and they have to sort of represent it on the page somehow. And that's a process of reduction. They can't show everything on the map. Otherwise, the map would be the size of the territory itself. And so they have to choose what to show and what not to show. And I was, you know, sort of looking at that as a parallel to the ways that we kind of map our lives online. But of course, what I learned as I read more about maps and interviewed people, and, you know, sort of worked on this investigation was that those aren't these sort of neutral choices, right? They're guided by the conventions of cartography, which are influenced by who pays for the maps. And so cartography as a field has all of these norms and conventions that are influenced by the priorities of power and profit, and so we might look at a map as a kind of neutral representation of a place, but of course it's infused with an agenda that is often invisible to us. And so it became really clear to me that, of course, this is true online as well, right? There's all kinds of nearly invisible norms and conventions that guide the way that we describe ourselves online, the way we share our lives online, the limitations of how we can organize, how we can connect, how we can express ourselves. And of course, all these conventions and norms exist within language too, the ways that we feel we can describe ourselves. And those things are often invisible to us as well. And so I do think that those boundaries are there, and they're as helpful as they are perilous, right? And when I think that the more that we begin to ask questions of where those norms come from and who they serve, especially in the ways that we describe ourselves online, I think, we'll be very well served by that. And again, the kind of stepping back piece, so much of why that feels counterintuitive or countercultural is because we are connecting and expressing ourselves on these platforms that are privately funded. They're not public space. And so, they are structured in ways that are designed to make the companies that run them money, not make us feel more human. It's a sort of plus if it happens, but it's not the point for them. And so, yeah, I think that we, that isn't to say that we can't. I don't remember if I draw this parallel in the book or not, but it's kind of like climate change. It's like I can recycle, but until the major companies that are responsible for the majority of carbon output are sort of forced to change the way that they do business, my recycling is not going to have nearly as much of an impact. So that's not to say that we can't become more aware of how these norms shape the way that we describe ourselves online, share our lives online. But there also has to be systemic change in order for it to affect, more and more people. So I got a little off track there, but
no.
But yeah, it gave me a lot to think about there. Thank you.
No, I don't think you did at all. I think that's and also I really like that you brought up the cartography and maps chapter of this book, because I think it's you've talked about this a couple times, or say writing, or the things that we focus on are the things that we're passionate about or that we are obsessive over. And that chapter was fascinating to me in those different kinds of ways, because honestly, it was something I really didn't know about map making and atlas making and maps, was that. And also at the same time, because when I got to that chapter, I was thinking so much about the idea of being online and building a persona, and I was thinking so much about world building, for the self, and for what it's online to create world building. And I think you address that so beautifully throughout the book, in this kind of way, and specifically in that map chapter, because you kind of bookend it with this idea of what's the actual process of this versus the kind of in the mind fantasized idea of the world building. And this is just me just gushing about
It's
fine, interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna zoom in another direction, and I'm gonna ask you, what are the things that work best in your life without the internet?
What are the things that work best in my life without the internet?
That's a really weird word. What are the things that you feel benefit from, or work better for you? Maybe is a better way.
Without the internet?
Yeah.
So definitely going to see a doctor rather than Googling medical questions, I think, is point number one. But at the end of the book, I talk about my relationship with my stepdad, who has Alzheimer's, and actually it was so interesting. Someone recently pointed out to me that someone who had been following me online for years, who read that that part of the book, was like, actually, I haven't really seen you post much about your stepdad. And it's true. I've only posted about him a couple of times, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is, I just I'm always like really cautious about telling other people's stories. And with him, I can't really ask him as much how much of his story I can share. I ended up writing, the story I tell about him in the book. I actually like sort of held on to it until almost the last minute. I mean, I went through the editing process with it with my various readers, but I didn't sort of talk to my mom about it until like right at the very end, because I was kind of putting it off. And I was like, I want to get your perspective on this, and like I'll cut it if it like doesn't work. But anyway, so she was, of course, like, she ended up, obviously it's in the book, so she was very okay with it. But I write about that relationship specifically because, so when I moved back to Minnesota, I started helping my mom take care of my stepdad, who has Alzheimer's. And that was, I mean, honestly, part of why I moved back was because we knew that was coming, and I wanted to, be able to be here. But also, I could help my mom out a little bit because I'm a writer, and my schedule is, some days my schedule is like, sitting at my computer all day, staring at the Word document, and nothing comes out. So I might as well just be spending that time with my stepdad. And so I was, I ended up, for a while, I was spending a few days a week with him so that my mom could go to work or just have time by herself. And when I was spending time with him, I like really couldn't be on my phone very much, which is probably part of why I didn't post about him that much, because I really needed to give him my full attention. And I found that so much came out of that experience for me, because like for a lot of my adult life, even in spaces where I've been spending time with people sort of physically, I'm still sort of like in and out of digital space. And so with him, that experience really wasn't happening. I was really just focused on him. And as a result, so much emerged from that. And again, that's not to say, like, I hope that if someone reads this book, they walk away feeling like, okay, this idea that life online is fake is one that we can kind of put behind us, I think, because all kinds of people use digital space to do things that are very real. But I do think that life online and life offline are different, and they both have sort of new opportunities that they present, but also, some challenges. And I think that for the kind of sustained attention that relationship demanded of me, that relationship needed, that's something I do better when I'm not sort of dividing my attention between digital space and offline space. And I also found that in the time that he and I spent together, time kind of slowed down. Whereas like online, I feel like time moves really quickly. The timeline is sort of always refreshing. Whereas with him, we would go on these really slow walks. And I would notice all kinds of things that I don't notice when I'm being stimulated by so much sort of coming at me at all times. And so, I draw on a lot of other people's really good work in IRL. How to Do Nothing was a book, Jenny Odell, that I found really useful. And she talks about the kind of slowing down and paying attention that I think stepping away from the internet and doing nothing really sort of invites. And that I think is something I do better offline. I pay attention better offline.
I mean, I like that idea, like, too, or so I was thinking about, like, there's just certain things where, like, the divided mind just can't work as well. And so much of that, too, is sometimes with, like, people that just need more of us, like, more. It is, like, a beautiful way. I don't know. It's, like, this book has, like, been, like, very fascinating for me to read. And I've been, like, very mindful and thoughtful after reading it, which is, like, something I don't say quite often, and I probably should more often. I feel like I've been monopolizing a lot of your time, but I do want to ask you at least, I have like 18 more questions, but I'm going to ask you just one more, which is the real actualized self a ravioli?
Thank you. See, I've totally failed. I like claimed I was gonna get you to make a ravioli joke, and then I've done nothing of the sort. So thank you for bringing that in. I mean, I do think it is in the sense of like, it's a sort of unending ravioli. It's like there's always another layer every time you bite in. There's like another ravioli. It's like a ravioli inside of a ravioli inside
My
of a ravioli.
God.
Yeah.
With Frisca, like ravioli, like Russian nesting doll ravioli.
Exactly. And I think it's like we have this idea if we can just figure out who we really are, if we can just find our real self, then we'll become actualized. And I think for many of us it's kind of like crisis prevention. It's like if I can figure out who I am, then I can prevent myself from getting into all the dumb shit that I get into when I'm not aware of myself and what I want and what I'm doing. But I also think that it's an illusion, this idea that we'll ever really sort of get to this actualized place. I mean, maybe some people do. I definitely don't think it's in the cards for me. But I think that like what is our real selves is this sort of constant unfolding. It is this other ravioli inside of the ravioli that leads us to another ravioli. So yeah, sure. The real actualized self is a ravioli. Yeah.
What better place to like end on for my questions is to say that it's an infinity ravioli.
Now I feel like my mission in life is no longer to like write another book or just I want to create the infinity of ravioli.
Infinity ravioli. That's beautiful. I love that.
Thanks.
I have a question, if I may ask Chris. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And it's something you touched on a little bit earlier, and I wanted to know if you had more thoughts that you could share with us. You talk about, I guess, towards the last half of the book, about the problems of a profit-driven internet and how the platforms like Twitter and Instagram really tend to make us think of ourselves as individuals and work against us thinking about ourselves as like a collective whole or part of a collective. Do you think there are ways to use social media to encourage us to think and act collectively as we're, entering this phase where collective action seems to be more and more important?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. I do think that this is like, I think I even say in the book, like the biggest sort of obstacle to feeling more like ourselves online is this profit-driven internet. And like, I think until that is transformed, like, we're just it's gonna be an uphill battle to feel that way online. On the other hand, I do think that, the argument that people make when they're trying to counter these arguments that the internet is sort of this inherently bad thing is that, the internet has provided all kinds of opportunities for people to organize. And I spend a full chapter in the book sort of talking about distance and the way that the internet can create distance between individuals by, encouraging us to see ourselves as individuals and to think of ourselves in terms of our needs and our, what we want to say. But it can also close distances that are impossible to close otherwise, like the fact that all three of us are in different cities and we're here on this call right now. And, I talk in the book about reaching out to this friend that I made on Twitter, one of the first people I ever followed who wasn't someone I knew offline, named Zane. And he had sort of been in my Twitter feed for almost a decade. And I had sort of seen little glimpses and bits and pieces of his life, but had kind of filled in all the gaps with my own sort of projections and hadn't really wondered what was going on, beyond that. And so I reached out to him and asked if he would be willing to tell me his story. And of course, he had this incredible story, and his life was, incredibly complex. And he was involved in communities that I had no idea he was involved in. And so, I share that story now, both to sort of say like, yeah, this is the kind of challenge of the profit-driven internet, is that it encourages us to see others as objects online, to kind of flatten everyone out and flatten ourselves out. But also, we're not totally powerless. We can reach out and organize and connect. And in fact, I found this really helpful study from BYU that was an 8-year longitudinal study. So they studied the same people over the course of 8 years, and they found that people could spend the exact same amount of time online, but have profoundly different experiences of the internet. And that a lot of it came down to whether or not they were sort of mindlessly using the internet. They were just chasing the kind of dopamine rush of engagement, or if they were kind of, purposefully, mindfully using the internet to connect, to organize, to learn more about themselves. And so I do think the deck is currently stacked against us right now with the internet as it exists today. But I think all change starts from organizing, and it's the idea that everything is impossible until it happens, right? Like the internet that we have right now. Yes, there are real limitations on how we can organize, but until we transform that, that's all it will be. But that doesn't mean that that's all it can be. So, yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm super grateful that it brought us here together tonight and crossed those distances, as you mentioned. Thank you both for joining me. This was really, really, really great. Everyone, you totally pick up Chris's book, whether it's from Pills Community Books, you go straight to the publisher's website, wherever. Highly recommend it. Any last words before we sign off?
I'm just so grateful to all of you. Thank you, everyone who is here. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Pilsen Community Books. I also haven't had dinner yet, so I'm going to go have not ravioli, but I'm going to go have some dinner. But thank you all so much. I really, really enjoyed this.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good night.